Welcome to World Revolution Channel. Today we present a summary of the book U.S. History 101 by Tony Robbins. How did the United States, a global superpower, rise from the barren wasteland? Kathleen Sears' U.S. History 101 takes you back in time to explore the key events, notable figures, and turning points that shaped the American nation from the Bering Bridge crossing to the Obama era, with lessons that will continue to reverberate into the future. Don't miss it if you want to understand the foundations of the modern world. Let's find out. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is a rigorous deep dive into Kathleen Sears' U.S. History 101. We're really treating it like a fast-track course to get at the foundations of the American experiment.
Which is such a good way to frame it, an experiment.
Right. We're talking about a nation that, as the sources point out, was intentionally designed, from scratch by its own people, and they were fully aware that what they were doing was, well, completely unusual.
It was radical. And what's fascinating is how the book defines this history from the outset as an experiment that is, quote, not yet complete. When the founders gathered, they weren't just tweaking a few laws.
No, not at all.
Or trying to create a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. That's what's on the Great Seal.
And we're going to trace that ambition today. We'll look at the high points, the incredible idealism, but also the devastating lows, the contradictions that were baked in from the start.
From the very first moments of contact, right up to the conflicts that really define the modern world.
And to get those foundations right, we have to start much, much further back than 1776 or even 1492. The book hits you with a pretty staggering fact check right away.
It does. It makes it clear that before any Europeans arrived, the American continents were already home to a thriving, complex population.
Not a barren wasteland. Not at all. We're talking an estimated 70 and 90 million people.
An incredible number. And they'd been here for over 20,000 years. So the real deep human history of this place starts there. It starts with a geological feature called Beringia.
Right, Beringia. And when you picture this, you shouldn't think of some tiny little ice bridge.
No, absolutely not. It was a massive landmass, maybe hundreds of miles wide.
How did that even form?
Well, so much of the Earth's water was locked up in these massive northern glaciers that global ocean levels were just dramatically lower. So this land that's now underwater connected what we call Siberia with Alaska.
And it wasn't just a path people rushed across.
Exactly. The sources suggest it was actually habitable. People lived on this landmass for about 5,000 years before they started moving east and south into the continents.
And what was driving that migration?
It was likely the food source. They were probably following big game, animals like the woolly mammoth.
And this link to Asia isn't just a theory, right? The book cites some really compelling DNA evidence.
Yeah, it points to Ilya Zakharov's 1997 expedition. They compared DNA from the Tuvan people who live about 2,000 miles southeast of Moscow.
Okay.
With samples from indigenous groups in America, specifically the Navajo and Apache. And they found a high percentage of exact DNA matches. It's strong confirmation of that Siberian link.
But even that story isn't quite so simple. There's this multiple origins theory.
Right, because the story of human settlement is always more complex. The fossilized skulls they've found from those early Beringians, they look structurally different from skulls of, say, Mesoamericans found further south.
So what does that suggest?
It suggests that while the land bridge was probably the main highway, some populations might have arrived by a completely different route, maybe by boat, from a location we don't even know. It was likely multiple waves of settlement over thousands of years.
Okay, so before we jump to the seismic shift of 1492, we do have to acknowledge the Vikings.
Absolutely. The Vikings are the most accepted theory of earlier non-indigenous visitors. We're talking centuries before Columbus.
And the evidence for this comes from?
Mostly from a German medieval historian, Adam of Bremen. In the 11th century, he wrote in his chronicle about being told by the Danish king, Sven Estridsson, about a place called Vinland.
Vinland. Because of the vines, right?
Exactly. He wrote that vines grew there naturally and produced excellent wine, and that crops grew without even being planted. It sounds like a paradise.
So while physical evidence is a bit scattered, the historical record from the 11th century is strong enough that we have to place them here before Columbus.
Definitely. Which brings us to 1492 and Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
And the book is very keen to correct the myths that still surround him.
Yeah, I was surprised how many of these are still so common. What's the first big one we need to debunk for everyone listening?
The biggest one, by far, is that Columbus did not prove the world was round.
Right. Educated people already knew that.
They'd known for centuries. The debate wasn't about the Earth's shape. It was about its size. And on that point, Columbus was catastrophically wrong,
And the second myth.
that he discovered the New World. I mean, given the 20,000 years of history in the Vikings we just talked about, that's just not accurate.
So what was his actual motivation?
It was purely economic. He sailed west with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria to find a new, faster sea route to Asia.
For spices.
For spices, yeah. They were essential for preserving food in an age without refrigeration, so they were incredibly valuable.
And his big miscalculation about the Earth's size is why he ended up where he did.
Exactly. He underestimated its circumference by as much as 25%. He thought the world was much smaller and that a trip to the Indies was manageable.
So when he lands on October 12, 1492, likely in the Bahamas, he's convinced he's in Asia.
Absolutely. He thought he'd reach the Indies, which is, of course, why he called the native people Indians, a misnomer that stuck for centuries.
Now, there was an initial cultural exchange, wasn't there?
There was a really significant one. Europeans learned about vital new crops, corn or maize, sweet potatoes, chili peppers, pumpkins, beans, and, of course, tobacco.
And the other way.
The natives adopted European animals like cattle, pigs, and horses, which completely changed their way of life and the ecosystem itself.
But this benign exchange was just overwhelmed by the tragedy of disease.
Immediately and utterly. The book stresses this point. Native Americans had zero resistance to European diseases, like smallpox, whooping cough, measles.
And the numbers are just hard to comprehend.
They are. Between 1494 and 1508, just in the Caribbean, an estimated 3 million people died. It was a demographic catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale.
And the cruelty of the conquest was just as immediate.
It was. Columbus's very first settlement, La Navidad, was built after the Santa Maria sank on Christmas Day. He left 39 men behind.
And when he came back?
He came back in 1493 to find no survivors. The settlement was gone. The reason? The Spaniards had immediately started pillaging and plundering the local communities, which led to, justified retaliation.
And that abuse quickly became institutionalized.
It did. Columbus started sending captured natives back to Spain as slaves. Then the Spanish crown authorized something called the encomienda system.
This is a really key concept, isn't it?
It's critical because it's really the origin of systemic oppression in the New World. It was basically a grant of slave labor disguised as a kind of trusteeship.
So on paper, the person receiving the grant was supposed to provide law and order and Catholic teaching.
Right. But in reality, it was just a license for brutal, forced labor and wealth extraction. It paved the way for all the later forms of chattel slavery. This Spanish precedent of violence, disease, and forced labor is just, it's profound.
Which is a good pivot to the English attempts, specifically Jamestown in 1607. Their motivation was a bit different.
It was. If the Spanish were about gold and conquest, the English settlement was really driven by corporate finance.
It was funded by the Virginia Company, which the book calls a prototype of a modern corporation.
That's right. They were looking for profit. They offered free passage to settlers, but in exchange, those settlers had to work for 7 years as indentured servants.
But things went wrong almost immediately.
Terribly wrong. They arrived too late to plant crops. They settled in a swampy, disease-ridden area, and many of the settlers were so-called genteel souls.
Meaning they weren't used to hard labor?
Not at all. They were gentry. So this combination of bad timing, bad location, and the wrong skills meant that only 38 of the original 104 settlers survived the first year. Some even ran away to live with the Native American tribes.
So who saved the colony?
Captain John Smith, a former crusader, a pirate, a very tough character. He imposed strict discipline, famously declaring, "He that will not work shall not eat."
He turned them into foragers and traders.
And crucially, he learned how to plant corn from the natives. That's what stabilized the whole venture.
Which brings us to the legend of Pocahontas.
Right. So in 1624, years after the fact, Smith wrote this account, claiming that the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, her real name was Matawaka, saved him from being executed.
But historians are skeptical.
They are, because he never mentioned this dramatic rescue in any of his earlier writings from right after it supposedly happened. It might have been an embellishment.
But she was still incredibly important historically.
Undeniably. She was captured around 1612, converted to Christianity, and then married an Englishman, John Rolfe, in 1614. That marriage secured a vital 8-year peace with the powerful Powhatan tribe.
And what was the engine that made Jamestown successful in the long run?
Tobacco.
Yeah.
John Rolfe figured out how to grow a milder strain that became incredibly popular in Europe. It became the cash crop.
And the need for labor to grow all that tobacco led directly to
the tragic start of chattel slavery in English America. As indentured servitude contracts expired, planters started buying kidnapped black Africans from Dutch traders. The economic success was built on a moral crisis from day one.
A very different story from the settlement up north with the Pilgrims and Puritans.
Very different motivations. They were religious reformers trying to purify the Church of England. They set sail on the Mayflower, aiming for Virginia.
But they got blown way off course.
Way off. They ended up in Massachusetts in November 1620, outside the legal jurisdiction of their charter. This caused a lot of tension on the ship.
Which led to the Mayflower Compact.
Exactly. To stop the infighting, they drew up this document, which is foundational to American political thought. It established a government based on the consent of the governed, with everyone agreeing to follow just and equal laws decided by majority rule.
A revolutionary step. But their first winter was brutal.
Horrific. Half the colonists died. Their survival depended completely on help from the Native Americans, especially Squanto, who taught them how to survive and negotiated a peace with Chief Massasoit.
Which led to the first Thanksgiving in 1621.
A 3-day feast to celebrate that fragile peace.
But the religious intensity that drove the Puritans had a dark side.
A very dark side. The book makes the point that, ironically, they were just as intolerant as the king they had fled. Mandatory church attendance, no recreation. It created a really severe, rigid social climate.
And that tension just explodes.
It explodes in 1692 with the Salem witch trials. It started with a few young women acting strangely, and a doctor diagnosed it as witchcraft.
The accusations started with the most vulnerable people in the community.
Always. Tituba, a West Indian slave, Sarah Good, a homeless woman, Sarah Osborne, who had a questionable reputation. Easy targets.
And it just spiraled out of control.
It did. 19 people were executed before public opinion finally turned against it all. And historians now see it as a symptom of deeper social conflicts, land disputes, old family feuds, class resentment, a perfect storm of fear and social tension.
These internal conflicts were happening while the major European powers were fighting for control of the continent itself.
Yes, the French wars in the New World. Britain and France were in a constant state of rivalry, and it all culminated in the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763.
This was the war that decided it all.
It really was. The main conflict was over the Ohio Valley. Both sides were building forts, and the British were starting to make alliances with tribes that had previously been allied with the French.
And this is where we first meet George Washington.
It is, though it wasn't a great start for him. He was sent to drive the French out and was defeated at the Battle of Fort Necessity in 1754, which officially kicked off the war.
And the outcome of that war?
A massive British victory. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave Britain control of Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi. France was essentially kicked off the continent.
But there was a huge unintended consequence to this victory.
A critical one.
Yeah.
Winning the war doubled Britain's national debt. And managing this huge new territory was incredibly expensive.
So they needed money.
They needed a lot of money. And they looked directly to the American colonies to pay for it, which of course set the stage for the entire revolution.
Before we get to the taxes, we have to talk about the economic engines that made the colonies so valuable in the first place: tobacco and cotton.
Right. Tobacco was the first king. We mentioned it with Jamestown. Its economic impact was just enormous. For a while in Virginia and Maryland, tobacco was literally legal currency.
But then cotton takes over.
It does, especially with the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. The new spinning machines in Britain created this bottomless demand for raw cotton.
And the American South had the perfect climate for it.
Perfect climate, fertile land. But growing cotton on that scale required a massive constant supply of labor. And that meant the importation of more and more slaves.
And then a single invention just locks the system into place.
The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. It made cleaning cotton seeds 50 times faster. The book is explicit. This invention made cotton king and institutionalized slavery as the king's servant. It directly links the Industrial Revolution to the Civil War.
So you have these incredibly profitable colonies and a British crown that's deeply in debt.
A recipe for conflict. King George III needed revenue, and he started to tighten the grip. First, the Currency Act, which said colonists couldn't issue their own money.
And then enforcing the old navigation acts.
Right, forcing them to ship goods only on British ships and sell only to Britain. And they actively stopped the colonies from developing their own manufacturing. It felt like deliberate suppression.
All of this boils down to that one famous phrase.
No taxation without representation. The colonists believed only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them.
And when boycotts didn't work, Things escalated with the Quartering Act,
forcing colonists to house and feed British soldiers, a huge invasion of privacy and a financial burden.
But the real breaking point was the Stamp Act of 1765.
This was the one, because it was the first internal tax. It wasn't about regulating trade. It was a tax on newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, even playing cards, things used inside the colonies every day.
It felt like a fundamental violation of their rights.
It did. It was repealed, but Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act, saying they could make any law they wanted for the colonies. And then came the Townshend Acts, with new taxes on glass, lead, and tea.
This is when organized resistance really starts to form, with groups like the Sons of Liberty.
Led by figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, they created these committees of correspondence to coordinate resistance across all the colonies.
And that tension finally spills into violence in 1770.
The Boston Massacre. British troops fired into a protesting crowd, killing 5 people. And the first to die was Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American heritage.
And Paul Revere's engraving of the event became powerful propaganda.
Brilliant propaganda. It showed the soldiers firing in a neat line into a helpless crowd, which wasn't exactly how it happened, but it inflamed passions across the colonies.
The final straw was the Boston Tea Party.
December 1773. It wasn't even about the price of tea, it was about the principle of the tax. So Adams, Revere, and others dumped 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor.
And the king's reaction just united the colonies against him.
Completely. He responded with the intolerable acts, closing Boston's port and imposing military rule. The other colonies saw that and thought, that could be us next.
Which takes us right to the first shots of the war, Lexington and Concord.
April 1775. The shot heard round the world. General Gage's plan was simple. Seize the colonial weapons at Concord and capture Sam Adams and John Hancock in Lexington.
But the colonists were warned.
By Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. The Minutemen were ready. And at Lexington, their captain, John Parker, said, "Stand your guard. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here."
The book is really clear that this was the ultimate failure of British policy. Just a complete misunderstanding of the colonists' resolve.
Willful and reckless. They pushed the colonies into a war.
But even then, independence wasn't the immediate goal for everyone.
No. At first, many still hoped for reconciliation. They sent the olive branch petition to the king.
But George III rejected it completely.
Called it a desperate conspiracy. Yeah. And when Parliament passed an act to ruin them economically and started hiring German mercenaries, that really hardened attitudes.
Then came the intellectual justification for a full break.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense, an absolute bombshell of a pamphlet published in January 1776.
What made it so effective?
Paine argued it wasn't just about taxes. The whole system of monarchy was rotten. He attacked the king directly, calling him the royal brute, and made this powerful case for American exceptionalism, calling it an asylum for mankind.
And it caught on like wildfire.
It did. Washington himself praised its unanswerable reasoning. It shifted public opinion dramatically towards independence.
So on July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies voted yes for independence.
A tense vote. It took a last-minute ride from Caesar Rodney of Delaware to make it happen. John Adams actually thought July 2nd would be the day everyone celebrated.
And the job of writing the Declaration fell to Thomas Jefferson.
The American Renaissance man. He was a lawyer, politician, inventor, architect.
But his life is defined by this massive contradiction.
The deepest one imaginable. He wrote the words, "All men are created equal," while owning hundreds of slaves his entire life. His home, Monticello, was built and run by enslaved people.
It's something we still wrestle with today.
Absolutely. Especially concerning Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was his late wife's half-sister. DNA evidence suggests he likely fathered her children, who were the only entire family of slaves he ever freed. It's a haunting part of the story.
And the man tasked with leading the army to make these ideals a reality was George Washington.
The citizen soldier. First, let's get rid of the cherry tree myth. Total invention.
Right. What was his real genius?
It was organizational. He had to take a citizen army, people who weren't inclined to discipline, often without proper weapons, and forge them into a force that could take on the most powerful military in the world.
And it was a long, hard-fought war.
It was. It started with a costly British win at Bunker Hill. The low point for the Americans was the struggle for New York in 1776, where Washington's army was nearly destroyed. That's when Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls."
But Washington turned it around at Trenton and Princeton.
Those surprise attacks were military miracles that restored morale and saved the revolution.
The real turning point, though, was Saratoga.
October 1777. The American victory there was so decisive, it convinced France to formally ally with the U.S.
And that French aid, their navy, their money, their troops was essential.
It was the game changer. It made Yorktown possible.
The final major battle.
October 1781. Washington brilliantly coordinated a combined land and sea operation with the French, trapping the British Army under Lord Cornwallis. His surrender essentially ended the war.
So with independence won, the next challenge was building a nation. And their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was a disaster.
It was way too weak. There was no president, no national court, and Congress couldn't tax anyone. It was chaos.
Which led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
Where they hammered out the system we have today.
Yeah.
But it was built on a series of major compromises, especially about slavery.
Right, like the 3/5 clause.
Counting a slave as 3/5 of a person for representation. And they agreed to allow the slave trade to continue until 1808. These were the painful deals made to hold the country together.
This new constitution then created a huge debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
The Federalists, like Hamilton, wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, like Patrick Henry, feared it would crush states' rights.
And the compromise there was the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. The first 10 amendments, guaranteeing individual liberties like free speech and religion, were added to get the Constitution ratified.
And Washington, once again, was called to lead as the first president.
He reluctantly accepted. And his presidency immediately revealed the new fault lines in American politics, particularly the split between Hamilton and Jefferson.
The beginning of political parties.
The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton's vision of a strong commercial nation versus Jefferson's vision of a more agrarian, decentralized one.
Washington served 2 terms, setting that precedent, and then under Jefferson, the country literally doubled in size.
The Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Napoleon needed money, so he sold this vast territory to the U.S. for just $15 million, the best land deal in history.
And Jefferson immediately sent Lewis and Clark to explore it.
To find a water route to the Pacific for commerce. Their journey captured the nation's imagination and fueled this idea of westward expansion.
That expansionist desire then helps lead to the next conflict, the War of 1812.
It does. The official causes were British seizure of American ships, but there was also a strong push from war hawks in Congress who wanted to conquer Canada and Florida.
The war was kind of a draw, but it had a huge impact.
It opened up the West for settlement, which forced the slavery issue to the absolute forefront. Every new state brought a new fight. Would it be slave or free?
And this brings us to the era of Andrew Jackson.
Jacksonian democracy. It expanded voting rights for white men, but as the book notes, it was also profoundly undemocratic.
Most notably with the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
A shameful moment. The government broke its treaties and forced tribes like the Cherokee off their land. The Supreme Court even enabled it.
But the one issue that overshadowed everything was slavery, America's original sin.
The country was just fundamentally divided. The industrial North versus the agricultural, slave-dependent South. Compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 worked for a while, but they were just bandages.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 ripped the bandage off.
It did. It allowed new territories to vote on slavery themselves, leading to Bleeding Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery settlers literally fought and killed each other.
And then the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 just threw gasoline on the fire.
It ruled that black people weren't citizens and had no rights, essentially nationalizing the Southern view on slavery. For many in the North, that was the last straw.
Amid all this, though, there was the Underground Railroad.
A network of secret routes and safe houses helping slaves escape to the North. Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, was its most famous conductor.
While the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery, it was also being stitched together by new technology.
Railroads and telegraphs. For the first time, you could send a message instantly from one coast to the other. And railroads made travel faster and easier, creating a more unified national culture.
And the idea of manifest destiny was still pushing the country westward.
The Mexican-American War in the 1840s led to the U.S. acquiring California and the Southwest. And then, in an unbelievable stroke of timing,
Gold.
Gold was discovered in California right as the treaty was being signed. The gold rush of 1849 brought hundreds of thousands of people there, forcing it into statehood and further upsetting the delicate balance over slavery.
All of this sets the stage for the election of 1860.
And Abraham Lincoln. He rose from a log cabin to become a lawyer who was passionately against the expansion of slavery.
His House Divided speech made him a national figure.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free.
He won the presidency in 1860 with no support from the South.
And the South made good on its threat. South Carolina seceded, followed by 6 other states. They formed the Confederacy.
And the flashpoint was Fort Sumter.
In Charleston Harbor, Lincoln sent supplies to the federal fort. The Confederates demanded its surrender, and on April 12, 1861, they opened fire. The Civil War had begun.
The North had the advantages in population and industry. The South was fighting a defensive war.
But the technology of war had outpaced the tactics. New rifles were far more accurate, leading to just horrific casualties. 620,000 soldiers died.
The tide started to turn for the Union in 1863.
With General Ulysses S. Grant's victory at Vicksburg, which split the Confederacy in two, and the bloody Union victory at Gettysburg.
And it was at Gettysburg that Lincoln gave his most famous speech.
Redefining the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. He called for a new birth of freedom.
He also signed the Emancipation Proclamation,
A military measure that freed slaves only in the seceding states. But it gave the war a powerful moral cause and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, which they did in huge numbers.
And finally, Grant cornered Robert E. Lee at Appomattox.
Lee surrendered in April 1865. Grant's first order was to stop the Union celebrations. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again."
But just days later, the nation was plunged back into grief.
Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The first presidential assassination, a tragic end to the nation's bloodiest chapter.
So we've traced this incredible arc, from the first migrations across a land bridge to a war that tested the very soul of the nation. We've seen how economic engines like tobacco and cotton created this deep moral wound.
And how the drive for expansion was in constant conflict with the ideals of freedom. This deep dive really shows that American history is defined by its contradictions, from Jefferson himself to the compromise in the Constitution.
Yeah, that 3/5 of a person, it's just jarring.
It is. And the question of who belongs, who governs, and who is truly free, that's been the central question since the very beginning. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The nation was founded on this powerful idea of escaping tyranny, of opposing taxation without representation. And yet the Constitution they created enshrined economic protections for slavery, a brutal internal tyranny for decades. So given how central the pursuit of happiness is to the Declaration, how should we today ethically reconcile the prosperity that was built on the economic pillars of tobacco and cotton, prosperity derived from stolen labor, with the high-minded ideals of the Founding Fathers?
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up the next topic. Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've brought us an extraordinary stack of source material today, a sweeping overview, excerpts from U.S. History 101.
It's quite a stack.
Yeah, we are about to cover, a monumental period. We're going to try and distill over 150 years of legislative, economic, and cultural upheaval into the most crucial nuggets of knowledge for you.
It's a massive undertaking. Our mission here, specifically for you, the learner, is not just to summarize these events. We want to quickly and thoroughly unpack the foundational shifts that define modern America.
Right.
We'll focus on the key tipping points, starting from the Civil War's aftermath right up to the Obama administration. The goal is to identify the personalities, the surprising implications of these moments that still shape our world today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Come back to continue U.S. History 101. We start right where the nation was, fundamentally redefined, with the legislative framework of Reconstruction and the inevitable reaction it provoked.
The immediate aftermath of the Civil War saw this.
Yeah.
This radical attempt to reform the very structure of American society. And it was solidified in what we now call the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th.
Okay, so the 13th Amendment, that was ratified in 1865. That's the one that officially abolished slavery.
Exactly. It finished the work that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had started. But then you get to the 14th.
And the 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, is, you could argue it's the most crucial piece of legislation in modern American history.
Oh, absolutely. It's the one that defines national citizenship for the first time. It extended it to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., which of course included former slaves.
And crucially, it included the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. That meant states couldn't just abridge the rights of citizens anymore.
Right, and it became a requirement. former Confederate states had to accept this amendment to be readmitted to the Union.
But what's often overlooked and what makes this amendment so complex is how its original intent was, well, almost immediately subverted.
That is the key insight. It was designed to protect the rights of freedmen, but by the late 19th century, conservative courts started using the 14th Amendment to protect corporations.
How did they manage that?
They argued that a corporation was a legal person.
A legal person.
Yes, and therefore it was entitled to the same due process rights as an individual. This effectively limited the ability of states to regulate big business, and it created this deep-seated legal irony right from the get-go.
That is staggering. A shield intended for newly freed slaves becomes a tool for industrial titans. And then you have the 15th Amendment, which granted African-American men the right to vote. So on paper, it looks like we had racial equality and political participation.
On paper, yes.
But how quickly did the reaction set in to negate all of that?
Almost immediately. I mean, there was no delay. This leads us straight into the reaction. The former Confederate states, while they might have begrudgingly complied with the letter of the law to rejoin the Union, they used every legal and extra-legal mechanism they could find to suppress the new electorate.
So what did that look like in practice?
By the 1890s, they had implemented things like poll taxes, property qualifications, and maybe the most effective tool was the subjective literacy test as a condition for voting.
And since decades of slavery had ensured widespread illiteracy among former slaves, this just wiped out their ability to vote.
It effectively eliminated the black vote in the South, yes. And this, in turn, fueled the need for the modern civil rights movement decades later. It was a direct consequence.
And this political suppression was, of course, backed by outright violence. We have to talk about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan.
We do. It started in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866. Originally, it was, believe it or not, a social organization for former Confederate officers.
Just a social club.
It didn't stay that way for long. It rapidly transformed into a violently racist vigilante group aimed at terrorizing the black community and preventing freedmen from exercising their new rights.
Did the federal government do anything?
It did, actually. The government under President Grant responded very strongly. Congress passed the Ku Klux Act in 1871. This authorized the president to use federal troops to suppress organized violence. And Grant's intervention was so successful that the KKK practically vanished. It went underground for decades.
But it came back.
It did. And it's important to note that when the KKK was revived in 1915, it was much more complex. It wasn't just a Southern phenomenon anymore. It gained millions of members nationwide.
What was fueling it then?
It was fueled by a new wave of anti-immigrant sentiment and the national release of this immensely popular yet fiercely racist film called The Birth of a Nation.
Right, so we're shifting from this political turmoil into a period of massive economic expansion.
Yeah.
The Gilded Age. This is defined by the titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Mellon.
Exactly. These men accumulated enormous, just unprecedented fortunes, and often, despite being described as absolutely ruthless in business, they also established these lasting institutions of learning and philanthropy.
It's that tension, isn't it? The tension between ruthless accumulation and massive philanthropy is really central to understanding this era.
It is. You take Andrew Carnegie. He's the classic rags to riches story. A Scottish immigrant worked his way up the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and then turned his wealth into total domination of Bessemer steel manufacturing.
And he believed in something called the gospel of wealth.
He did. It was this idea that the wealthy had a moral obligation to use their money to help the poor help themselves. Not just handouts, but creating opportunities.
And his legacy really speaks to that belief. His philanthropy was just vast. He established the network of Carnegie libraries all over the world.
The Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is now Carnegie Mellon University.
And of course, Carnegie Hall. When he sold his company to J. Pierpont Morgan in 1901, it formed the billion-dollar United States Steel Corporation.
And he became the richest man in the world, specifically so he could devote the rest of his life to giving it all away.
Now, you contrast that with someone like John D. Rockefeller Sr.
A very different story. His Standard Oil Trust was notorious for brutally crushing labor opposition. I mean, they used every means necessary to consolidate the oil industry into a monopoly.
These men really signaled a complete shift in power, didn't they? It wasn't a land-based aristocracy anymore. It was this new industrial upper class, all focused on extraction and manufacturing.
That's the core of it. And then you have Andrew Mellon, who didn't just build industrial wealth, he translated it directly into political power.
Right. He served as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents, What was his big economic focus?
Mellon's focus was explicitly ideological. He sought massive cuts to the income tax, specifically on the top layers of the population.
Why? What was the argument?
He argued that reducing taxes on the wealthy would stimulate investment, and that would spur economic growth for everyone. It's a philosophy that it's a direct precursor to supply-side economics, or what we'd later call Reaganomics.
But the deep irony, and this is something that's often overlooked, is his shocking advice when the Depression hit.
Precisely. When the market collapsed, Mellon's counsel to President Hoover was famously harsh, just completely laissez-faire.
What did he say?
He reportedly said, and this is a quote, "Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system."
Wow.
It reflected this strict belief that the government should do nothing, just allow the market to self-correct no matter what the human cost was.
That philosophy naturally led to a massive public pushback against unregulated corporate power and these monopolies, the call for busting the trusts.
And Theodore Roosevelt became the face of this reaction.
Roosevelt, coming to power at 42 after McKinley's assassination, he just embodied this new progressive energy.
He did. He was determined to regulate the excesses of the capitalist class that he himself came from. He used the concept of the square deal to define his moderate approach.
And he made it really clear he didn't want to disband all trusts. He made a distinction, didn't he?
Yes, between good trusts that he felt benefited the public and bad trusts that operated unfairly or abused their power. His key action was using the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which had been pretty much neglected up to that point.
And he used it against J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company Railroad Trust in 1902.
He did, and the fact that the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 against the trust just shows you how controversial and powerful this move was. It was a direct challenge to this monolithic corporate power.
Roosevelt's interventionism, it seems like it was a necessary response to the growing desperation of the industrial workforce.
It was. These large factories, they offered no protection. No protection against illness, inflation, or just being fired for no reason. This led directly to the rise of organized labor.
Right. Workers realized that collective action was really their only defense. So we see the rise of unions like the Knights of Labor, which was a secret fraternal order.
And then the more focused and ultimately more effective American Federation of Labor, the AFL. It was founded in 1881 and led by Samuel Gompers.
And Gompers focused on really pragmatic goals: higher wages, better working conditions. Simple as that.
But the struggle for these rights was often brutally violent. The Haymarket Affair in 1886 in Chicago just perfectly illustrates the immense tension.
What was the context there?
Workers were on strike demanding an 8-hour workday. Violence erupted when police fired into a crowd outside the McCormick harvesting machine plant. So a rally was held the next day at Haymarket Square to protest the violence.
And that rally was peaceful initially.
It was, till the police arrived and commanded the crowd to disperse. At that moment, an unidentified person threw a dynamite bomb. It killed 7 police officers.
And the consequence was this period of national hysteria.
Total hysteria.
Yay.
8 prominent anarchists, many of whom were labor leaders, were arrested, they were convicted, and 4 were subsequently hanged.
Despite there being absolutely no evidence linking them directly to the person who threw the bomb.
None whatsoever. This crackdown was a massive setback for the entire labor movement. It severely crippled groups like the Knights of Labor for years.
It just reveals how quickly public fear of radicalism could be leveraged by the powerful establishment to crush legitimate worker grievances.
Exactly. And while labor and capital were fighting, this other revolution was happening, a technological one that would define the physical landscape of America. The automobile.
It was arguably the most culturally and physically transformative invention since, the telegraph and the railroads.
And the car's mass adoption in America is entirely due to Henry Ford's genius in mass production.
He didn't invent the assembly line, though?
No, that was Ransom E. Olds in 1902. But Ford refined it. He expanded the process, dividing the assembly into these minute, discrete tasks. This allowed him to cut production time down so drastically that a Model T could be assembled in about 15 minutes.
And that speed translated directly to affordability. The Model T, which started production in 1908, it became an immediate phenomenon.
Right, because Ford had this realization. If he wanted to sell millions of cars, he needed workers who could actually afford them.
So he famously paid his workers $5 a day.
A huge wage at the time. It enabled a factory worker to buy a Model T for about 4 months' pay.
The societal impact was just revolutionary. It created vast new service industries, gas stations, motels, garages.
It dramatically increased the travel range of the average American family. It catalyzed the growth of suburbs. It changed dating habits, family vacations, the entire infrastructure of American life.
And the car instantly became this powerful, essential status symbol of middle-class freedom.
Absolutely. So our historical sprint now takes us across the Atlantic and into the entanglement of World War I.
The immediate catalyst was, of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. But the true causes were much deeper. This complex web of interlocking treaties, imperial rivalries, and the unstable, slow breakup of the Ottoman Empire.
And President Wilson desperately tried to maintain neutrality, but the economic pull was just too strong. By 1917, American financial interests had sold over $2 billion worth of supplies to the Allied countries.
Britain's naval dominance forced Germany to rely on its U-boats, its submarines, to disrupt this critical supply line, and that made American ships targets.
Right, and the major turning point in American sentiment was the sinking of the British Cunard liner, the Lusitania, in May 1915.
That resulted in the deaths of 198 passengers, including 126 Americans.
And this was despite German warnings that had been placed in American newspapers. Now, the U.S. denied it at the time, but the ship was carrying contraband munitions.
The decisive move that finally broke U.S. neutrality came in February 1917.
When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, U-boats just started sinking American ships without any warning. Wilson broke diplomatic relations, and after 2 more attacks, he asked Congress to declare war on April 6, 1917.
The war concluded with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and Wilson's very ambitious proposal for lasting peace, the 14 points.
And the ultimate goal of those points, the capstone, was point 14, the creation of a League of Nations, an organization he believed was essential to prevent any future global conflict.
But the profound implication for the U.S. was this immediate return to isolationism.
Exactly. The U.S. Senate ultimately refused to ratify the treaty and join the League of Nations. And this rejection just crippled the organization from its very inception. It ensured the U.S. would try to turn inward for the next 2 decades, despite its new status as a global economic power.
So we transition immediately from that to the Roaring Twenties, a period of both, deep political scandal and incredible cultural vibrancy.
Politically, you have Warren G. Harding elected on a promise to return America to normalcy, but his term was cut short by his death amid massive corruption scandals.
Most notably Teapot Dome, where his Interior Secretary, Albert B. Fall, was actually jailed for illegally leasing public oil fields.
And Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, he just perfectly embodied the era's focus on commerce. He famously said, "The business of America is business."
But culturally, the decade just exploded. We saw the flowering of the Harlem Renaissance, producing these monumental figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston.
While jazz music, with pioneers like W.C. Handy, provided the soundtrack to this new urban landscape, radio also rose as a mass medium. Stations like KDKA broadcast the 1920 election results, and WSM started the Grand Ole Opry.
Yet the era was just fraught with social tension. Prohibition, enacted by the 18th Amendment in 1919, prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transport of liquor.
And it was a spectacular social failure. It immediately empowered organized crime and bootlegging on a massive scale.
And then you have the Scopes trial in 1925, which became the ultimate stage for this cultural rift between religious traditionalism and modern scientific thought.
Right. A biology teacher, John Stokes, was arrested in Tennessee for teaching evolution. The trial featured the legal titan Clarence Darrow against the religion populist William Jennings Bryan. It became this carnival-like national spectacle, just showing the deep division in the country.
And Stokes was found guilty.
He was, though the verdict was later overturned on a technicality. It was more about the theater than the legal outcome.
We also see a really dark shift in policy with the Immigration Act of 1924.
This act tightened immigration policy by setting these highly restrictive quotas. It was set at 2% of each nationality present in the U.S., way back in 1880.
And that specific year was chosen deliberately.
Oh, absolutely. It was chosen because it preceded the major waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and it effectively halted all immigration from Far Eastern countries. It was a clear legislative move away from the country's welcoming tradition, driven by this nativist sentiment.
Amidst all this upheaval, the role of women was changing fundamentally, culminating in votes for women.
Exactly. The traditional constraints where husbands controlled women's wages and property, they were eroding. They were replaced by this modern image of the flapper, symbolizing new freedoms to smoke, dance, and pursue careers outside the home.
And the right to vote was the culmination of a decades-long struggle. It was led by these relentless suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Coffin Mott, Susan B. Anthony,
And the later successful campaigner, Carrie Chapman Catt. Their work finally resulted in the 19th Amendment, which was ratified on August 18, 1920, granting women the right to vote.
But the fight for bodily autonomy was really just beginning, and that was championed by Margaret Sanger.
Sanger's crusade for contraceptives and birth control stemmed from her belief that women deserved control over their own bodies and their family size. She opened the nation's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn in 1916.
And for decades, she fought against obscenity laws that restricted the dissemination of birth control information.
She did. The legal victory she worked toward didn't fully arrive until a 1965 Supreme Court case that invalidated laws banning the dissemination of birth control information entirely. It marked a huge, though still controversial, step in reproductive rights.
And the political and cultural expansion of the 20s crashed headfirst into economic devastation with the crash of 1929.
The market jitters began on October 24, leading to the devastating Black Tuesday on October 29. But while the crash was symbolic, the depression that followed had multiple, deeper, systemic causes.
Right. The sources point to some serious structural flaws, growth that was too rapid and speculative.
Wealth that was highly concentrated among a few, which meant too few consumers could actually buy the industrial output, leading to severe cutbacks.
And ruinous single-crop farming in the agricultural heartland.
All of it together. And Herbert Hoover, despite being a successful engineer and a humanitarian, he became the nation's scapegoat.
His administration's economic isolationism and rigid adherence to this laissez-faire belief that government assistance would destroy American self-reliance, it led to Hoovervilles.
These wretched shanty towns that symbolized the poverty. His vilification was cemented by the dispersal of the Bonus Army in 1932.
These were World War I veterans who marched on Washington demanding their promised payments.
And Hoover ordered the military, led by General Douglas MacArthur, to disperse them using tear gas and bayonets. It was a public relations nightmare that absolutely ensured Hoover's political defeat.
And that failure opened the door for Franklin D. Roosevelt, the patrician who, despite his wealthy background and his crippling battle with polio, became the champion of the poor.
He defeated fear itself by promising immediate, bold action. And FDR's first 100 days were unprecedented in their speed and scope.
He started by declaring bank holidays to stop panicked depositors from emptying the institutions.
Which then led quickly to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, guaranteeing deposits up to $5,000. It restored public confidence almost overnight.
And the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to regulate stock markets and prevent future crashes. These were bedrock, permanent changes.
The New Deal unleashed what its critics call the alphabet soup of recovery programs.
What are some of the major ones that stand out?
Well, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was incredibly popular. It provided jobs for hundreds of thousands of young men in rural camps working on environmental projects.
But the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, that one was highly controversial.
Very. It paid farmers to take land out of cultivation to reduce surpluses and raise prices. This meant that during a time of widespread hunger, the government was literally paying farmers to destroy crops and livestock.
An action that was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court?
Correct. But the infrastructure work was enduring, particularly the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA.
This was a monumental project. It built dams, brought electricity, flood control, and economic development to thousands of people across 7 poverty-stricken southeastern states.
And beyond infrastructure, one of the most lasting social programs was Social Security, passed in August 1935. This legislation established a mandatory retirement fund, unemployment insurance, and welfare grants.
A crucial safety net, though it was implemented decades later than similar programs in Europe.
True. And what's fascinating here is the composition of his advisory team, the Brain Trust.
Right. FDR consciously moved away from traditional political cronies.
Instead, he relied on government outsiders, brilliant professors, lawyers, social workers, people like Felix Frankfurter, Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet secretary, and Harry Hopkins. This reliance on intellectual expertise led to this lasting legacy of increased government involvement in the economic security of its citizens.
So the nation's economic recovery, fueled by the New Deal, was only really fully realized when the country converted its industrial might to the global crisis of World War II.
And the prelude to that was terrifying. The rise of Hitler and Mussolini, the Rome-Berlin axis, and Hitler continually defying the Treaty of Versailles by rearming and annexing territory.
The war officially began when Hitler invaded the Polish corridor on September 1st, 1939.
And despite this really strong isolationist sentiment in the U.S., epitomized by the America First Committee, FDR knew the U.S. couldn't remain neutral indefinitely. He ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940 and initiated the Lend-Lease program,
providing destroyers and war material to Allied nations, but that neutrality was irrevocably shattered by Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941. An attack that caught the U.S. military leadership completely by surprise. Germany and Italy declared war 3 days later, plunging the nation into a total global conflict.
On the home front, the reaction was swift and damaging.
It was. Driven by fear and hysteria early in 1942, President Roosevelt ordered the forced relocation of over 100,000 Japanese Americans.
Many of whom were U.S. citizens.
Yes, they were moved to these inland internment camps. While FDR later reversed the order in 1944, citing its unconstitutionality, it remains one of the darkest stains on the American civil liberties record.
In the Pacific, the tide began to turn in 1942 with two crucial naval victories.
The Battle of the Coral Sea, which stopped the Japanese advance toward Australia, and then the decisive Battle of Midway in June 1942. There, the U.S. sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, giving the U.S. supremacy at sea.
The cost, however, was immense, particularly during the brutal battle for Iwo Jima in early 1945, which secured vital airstrips needed for bombing runs against Japan.
Meanwhile, in Europe, the long-awaited D-Day landings occurred on June 6, 1944, in Normandy. Securing Omaha Beach involved the fiercest fighting for American troops.
And later, the Germans mounted a desperate surprise counterattack known as the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944.
Before the Allies regrouped and finally secured VD Day on May 8, 1945.
The war concluded with the Manhattan Project and the subsequent use of the atomic bomb. This secret program, led by Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, New Mexico, tested the A-bomb on July 16, 1945.
And President Truman authorized the use of the bombs on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. The official reason was to compel Japan's surrender without a land invasion, which was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives.
But the historical consensus points to a secondary, darker motive here.
It does. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th, right between the two bombs. The second bomb, dropped on Nagasaki, is widely speculated to have been intended, at least in part, as a definitive demonstration of America's overwhelming nuclear arsenal.
A warning shot.
A warning shot to the quickly emerging rival superpower, the USSR. This act signaled the immediate transition from a wartime alliance to a Cold War competition.
Life on the home front saw dramatic change, not just tragedy. Increased industrialization, operating at full capacity to supply the war, finally pulled the economy completely out of the Great Depression.
And women entered the workforce in massive numbers, earning that iconic nickname, Rosie the Riveter.
Frugality and sacrifice were mandatory. The Office of Price Administration, the OPA, oversaw strict rationing for critical goods like sugar, meat, tires, and gasoline, using ration books.
We hear stories about women even drawing lines on their legs to simulate the seams of stockings, which were scarce. However, the most lasting social infrastructure created during this time was the GI Bill of 1944.
The Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It provided massive benefits, low-interest mortgages, college tuition, medical care to returning veterans.
And this legislation became the engine of the post-war economy. It directly fueled the subsequent baby boom, the explosion of higher education, and the creation of mass suburbia.
And FDR, the only four-term president, died in April 1945, just before victory,
leaving the impossible task of managing the post-war world and the atomic threat to his vice president, Harry S. Truman. And that threat quickly ushered in the era of McCarthyism, driven by fear and the Red Scare.
The nuclear dread was just pervasive. The U.S. tested the hydrogen bomb and estimated 500 times more powerful than the A-bomb in 1952.
Alarmingly, this fear was institutionalized for children. They were taught to participate in these nuclear bomb drills, uselessly ducking beneath their desks.
And the successful Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 fueled fears that the U.S. was losing ground in science and technology,
which led to massive funding increases for STEM education through the National Defense Education Act. Domestically, this fear manifested as the Red Scare, propelled by the testimony of Whittaker Chambers to HUAC.
HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yes, Chambers testified that Alger Hiss, a State Department official, was a communist spy, which led to Hiss's perjury conviction in 1950.
And the witch hunt found its most explosive face in Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. In 1950, he made this sensational and completely unsupported charge that the State Department employed over 200 communists,
Famously stating, "I have in my hand a list." These unsupported accusations became known as McCarthyism, and they ruined countless careers through rumor and innuendo.
And HUAC focused particular scrutiny on Hollywood.
The Hollywood 10 writers and directors, they refused to answer questions, citing the Fifth Amendment, and were sentenced to prison. This atmosphere of hysteria perfectly illustrates how civil liberties could be suspended under the extreme pressure of a perceived national threat.
That Cold War tension soon turned hot with the Korean War.
When North Korea crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, Truman termed the conflict a police action under UN command, led by General Douglas MacArthur.
And MacArthur took this massive gamble with a bold amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950.
It was brilliant. It successfully recaptured Seoul and shattered the North Korean lines. However, the decision to then push north of the 38th parallel to completely expel communism, that was a fatal error.
Because it brought China into the war.
Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers flooded across the border. The ensuing conflict turned into a brutal, grinding stalemate.
Eisenhower inherited the unresolved war in 1953, and an armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953.
With the peninsula still divided at the 38th parallel. No country was satisfied, and the war set this deeply unpopular precedent for limited American involvement in Asian civil conflicts.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the legacy of Reconstruction's failure was the entrenched Jim Crow system.
A whole network of state and local laws in the South mandating segregation in schools, transportation, hospitals, and restricting voting via literacy tests and poll taxes. The mid-century was defined by the struggle against this system.
Led by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle truly ignited with Rosa Parks in Montgomery in 1955, refusing to give up her seat on the bus.
Which led to the year-long Montgomery bus boycott, organized by King. He was deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent direct action. King's core political tool was moral persuasion, emphasizing love and non-aggression in the face of violent opposition.
The massive scope of the movement culminated in the March on Washington in August 1963. Over 300,000 people gathered for jobs and freedom.
And King's I Have a Dream speech was the emotional peak, calling on the nation to fulfill its founding creed, that all men are created equal. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, cementing his global status as a moral leader.
Tragically, the struggle was cut short. King was assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, the day after delivering his prophetic "I've been to the mountaintop" speech.
And his death underscored a rising impatience among young African Americans, leading to the emergence of Black Power.
The Black Power movement contrasted sharply with King's nonviolent integrationist approach.
It did. You had earlier figures like Marcus Garvey, whose Universal Negro Improvement Association promoted Black economic independence, even a symbolic return to Africa. More powerfully, you had Malcolm X,
who broke with the Nation of Islam in 1964 and began shifting his rhetoric.
Yes, toward political analysis. He started suggesting that the problems facing African Americans were systemic, rooted in capitalism and white power structures. He even began advocating for working with white activists toward common goals, right before his own assassination.
Politically, the decade was defined by John F. Kennedy. At 43, the youngest elected president, a dynamic Catholic senator from Massachusetts who narrowly defeated Nixon.
And his success was partially credited to the first-ever televised debates, where a youthful, charismatic Kennedy appeared sharp while Nixon looked haggard and uncomfortable.
Kennedy immediately energized the nation with his inaugural challenge. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
He promised a new frontier, inspiring the creation of the Peace Corps and committing the nation to the monumental goal of putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
However, his administration was immediately tested by Cold War threats, particularly the situation in Cuba.
Right. After Fidel Castro took power in 1959 and aligned the island nation with the Soviet Union, you suddenly had a communist regime just 90 miles from U.S. shores.
The first failure was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961.
A total disaster. 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exiles were easily defeated, resulting in deep embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. And this tension peaked dramatically in October 1962 during the Missiles of October.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. U.S. reconnaissance planes spotted Soviet ballistic missiles being installed in Cuba.
Kennedy responded by demanding their immediate removal and instituting a naval quarantine, a blockade, essentially around Cuba. For 13 tense days, the world was literally 1 minute to midnight, bracing for potential nuclear war.
And the resolution was complex. It required profound grace under pressure from both leaders.
It did. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles and allow UN inspection. In return, the U.S. guaranteed it would not invade Cuba, and secretly agreed to remove U.S. intermediate-range missiles located in Turkey.
This incident tested the limits of brinkmanship and led directly to the establishment of the White House-Kremlin hotline.
The final defining conflict of the decade was Vietnam, a war that ultimately shattered the nation's political and social consensus. The key escalation point was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964.
An alleged attack on U.S. naval destroyers that led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing President Johnson to wage war in Southeast Asia.
Later investigations cast serious doubt on the reality and severity of that alleged attack. Nonetheless, troop levels escalated rapidly, reaching a peak of 550,000.
The war included shocking atrocities like the My Lai massacre in 1968. As it became increasingly unpopular, massive anti-war protests mounted, ultimately compelling Johnson not to seek re-election.
The domestic impact of the war led to extreme violence, notably the Kent State shooting in 1970, where National Guardsmen killed 4 unarmed students during a protest.
The war finally ended when Nixon initiated a gradual withdrawal, leading to a formal peace treaty in 1973. South Vietnam surrendered 2 years later in April 1975.
And the lasting psychic cost is powerfully marked by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in D.C., listed 58,249 American names.
Emerging from the Cold War's shadow, we turn our attention upward to the space race.
Following Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in 1961, NASA was heavily funded. The Mercury and Gemini projects led to orbital flights by Alan Shepard and John Glenn, setting the stage for Kennedy's ultimate goal.
That goal was realized with the Apollo program. On July 21, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. Armstrong's iconic quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," was viewed by a global audience of hundreds of millions.
And the Space Center was rightfully renamed the John F. Kennedy Space Center. Yet the journey was not without tragedy. We have to remember the 2 space shuttle disasters.
The Challenger explosion in 1986, which killed Krista McAuliffe and her crew just 73 seconds after launch.
Due to O-ring failure in cold temperatures. And then the Columbia disaster in 2003, which broke apart upon re-entry due to foam damage sustained during launch. These events demonstrated the persistent high risk of pushing technological frontiers.
Simultaneously, America was undergoing a cultural revolution with the counterculture. The idealism and impatience of the youth, often called hippies or flower children, congregated in places like Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco.
Leading to the infamous Summer of Love in 1967. The culmination of this youth movement was the massive Woodstock Music and Art Fair in 1969, attracting over 300,000 people to Bethel, New York.
And Jimi Hendrix's controversial, distorted electric guitar rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner was this powerful artistic protest against the contemporary United States and the ongoing Vietnam War.
Culturally, this era also saw Motown Records, led by Berry Gordy Jr., successfully break racial barriers, bringing Black artists like Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross to mainstream superstardom.
And folk music, championed by figures like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, provided the raw, acoustic protest songs for the entire generation.
The momentum of social change continued with women's liberation. The push for equality reached the Supreme Court in 1973 with Roe v. Wade,
which established trimester rules for abortion based on the right to privacy, instantly creating the intense national division between pro-choice and pro-life groups that defines contemporary politics.
The push for structural equality was led by activists like Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, and Gloria Steinem, who co-founded Mrs. Magazine. They fought tirelessly for equal pay, subsidized childcare, and military opportunity.
However, despite extensions and immense effort, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, failed to be ratified by the required 38 states.
Largely due to organized conservative opposition. Another critical movement that emerged in this period was environmentalism. The catalyst was Rachel Carson's groundbreaking 1962 book, Silent Spring,
which raised massive public awareness about the devastation caused by industrial pesticides like DDT. This scientific exposure fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their relationship with the natural world.
And this new awareness laid the groundwork for the first Earth Day on April 22, 1970, which saw tens of thousands advocating for legislative reform.
The movement has evolved significantly to address the modern concern over global warming, popularized by figures like Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, focusing on the scientific consensus regarding melting polar ice caps and rising ocean levels.
As the country navigated these social transformations, the political system was shaken to its core by Watergate. In June 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate complex.
And the scandal lay not in the break-in, but in the massive cover-up orchestrated by the Nixon administration. The crucial revelation was the discovery of Nixon's routine taping of all Oval Office conversations.
Claiming executive privilege, Nixon refused to release them, leading to a constitutional crisis known as the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973.
Nixon ordered Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox fired, leading to the dramatic resignations of the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, until Solicitor General Robert Bork finally carried out the order.
The Supreme Court ultimately ruled against Nixon. When the smoking gun tape was released, it confirmed that Nixon had planned to use the CIA to impede the FBI investigation as early as June 1972.
Proving his direct involvement in the obstruction of justice. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974.
Gerald Ford took over, becoming the first person to serve as both VP and president without being elected to either office. His decision to pardon Nixon in September 1974 was hugely unpopular,
and is widely believed to have cost him the 1976 election.
Moving into the 1980s, the nation sought stability and a return to traditional values, finding a face for the new conservatism in Ronald Reagan.
The former actor and California governor, often called the Great Communicator. He defeated Jimmy Carter in 1980, bolstered by the release of the 52 Iran hostages, held for 444 days on the very day of his inauguration.
Reaganomics defined his policy. A massive reduction of federal programs, deregulation, and steep income tax cuts on the top layers. A direct descendant of Andrew Mellon's philosophy.
This resulted in low inflation, but led to a skyrocketing national debt and the conspicuous consumer culture of yuppies, dramatically increasing the gap between rich and poor.
Despite surviving an assassination attempt early in his first term by John Hinckley Jr., Reagan won re-election by a landslide in 1984, earning him the nickname the Teflon presidency because negative events just didn't seem to stick.
However, one major scandal did threaten his administration: Iran-Contra.
This secret policy unraveled when it was discovered the administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, a declared enemy, and illegally diverted $30 million in profits to help the Contras fight the Sandinista government in Nicaragua.
And this directly violated congressional prohibitions, specifically the Bowen Amendment.
Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council staff, set up the entire covert support structure. The congressional hearings were massive, focusing on how much Reagan knew.
Ultimately, North and Admiral John Poindexter were convicted, though their convictions were later overturned on technicalities.
And while no concrete evidence ever proved Reagan knew of the specific diversion of funds, the administration was heavily admonished for its massive incompetence and willful blindness in running illegal, parallel foreign policies.
The end of the Reagan era ushered in the definitive end of the Cold War with the collapse of communism. This was primarily driven by the catastrophic failure of the rigid Soviet command economy,
which forced Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to implement reforms. Perestroika, which was economic reform allowing limited private ownership, and glasnost, political openness and transparency.
The moment that crystallized this massive geopolitical shift was the toppling of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, as East Germans were finally permitted to cross.
The breakup was complete in 1991, with the USSR dissolving and being replaced by independent republics like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, concluding a half-century rivalry.
George H.W. Bush, having declared a new world order, quickly faced his major international test with the First Gulf War.
After successfully sending troops to Panama in 1989 to capture the drug trafficker Manuel Noriega, the major crisis came when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990.
Bush successfully mobilized an unprecedented UN coalition that included both Arab nations and the former rival, Russia.
Operation Desert Storm began with a sophisticated, highly technological air war utilizing stealth bombers and jamming radar, followed by a rapid, decisive ground war beginning February 24, 1991.
The conclusion was a decisive military victory with very low Allied casualties, only 149 soldiers killed in action. However, Bush cited his objective as liberating Kuwait, not removing Saddam Hussein from power.
And this strategic decision to leave Saddam in power created significant long-term repercussions for the region, even as Bush enjoyed an immediate 90% approval rating back home.
The post-Cold War confidence that followed the Gulf War was brutally shattered on 9/11.
This sequence of attacks on September 11, 2001, Flight 11 hitting the North Tower at 8:45 a.m., Flight 175 hitting the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon at 9:43 a.m.
And the heroic passengers of Flight 93 forcing the plane down in Pennsylvania at 10:10 a.m. The perpetrator was al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who was harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
President Bush demanded the Taliban hand over the al-Qaeda leadership, leading to the Afghan and Iraq wars. The immediate domestic reaction was massive legal and bureaucratic change.
Just 45 days after the attack, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act with virtually no public debate. This massively expanded the surveillance and investigative powers of domestic law enforcement.
And it was crucial for you to understand that Section 213 of that act, it authorized sneak and peek search warrants, allowing federal agents to conduct searches without immediately notifying the target.
And this provision was authorized not just for terrorism, but for any federal crime, including misdemeanors.
This rapid centralization of power also led to the creation of the cabinet-level Department of Homeland Security in 2002, a monumental restructuring that combined 22 existing federal agencies into one vast, complex organization.
Meanwhile, the rationale for the Iraq War was being built. We know that Bush and Cheney immediately sought a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein, despite intelligence agencies denying any operational link.
The war was declared on March 19, 2003, without a UN Security Council mandate operation, Iraqi freedom, ignoring massive, coordinated, "the world says no to war" protests globally.
The military victory was rapid, but the occupation of Iraq quickly became a fiasco. Troops failed to find any weapons of mass destruction,
forcing the administration to continually shift its justification from WMDs to Saddam's alleged intent to use them. Chaos swept the cities immediately following the invasion, with rampant looting.
And Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld famously dismissed the chaos, saying, quote, "freedom's untidy."
But the occupation made critical blunders, most notably the decision by Paul Bremer to dissolve the entire Iraqi army, leaving hundreds of thousands of jobless, angry, and armed former soldiers.
And barring all Ba'athist Party members from office, excluding crucial, talented administrators needed to run the country.
These decisions are credited with fueling the subsequent devastating insurgency. And as the wars dragged on, the nation faced its worst economic crisis since the 1930s, the Great Recession.
The disaster began when the housing bubble burst in 2007-2008. Housing prices plummeted by 30% as adjustable mortgage rates reset, leading to millions of foreclosures.
This financial collapse was fueled by years of loosened regulations that permitted complex financial instruments to spread systemic risk. We're talking about instruments like credit default swaps.
Essentially, insurance policies on mortgage bonds that were leveraged without any collateral. Key institutions like Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and AIG executives infamously claimed they were too big to fail.
The government's response was the bailout. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, initiated in October 2008, was controversial. Instead of simply loaning money, it was designed to purchase troubled assets and equity from key institutions.
It ultimately paid out $432 billion. A controversial but ultimately effective measure widely credited with preventing the collapse of the financial system and averting a second Great Depression.
And this backdrop of war and economic crisis created the conditions for the political rise of Barack H. Obama. He emerged from obscurity, challenging the favored Hillary Clinton, gaining national fame from his inspiring 2004 Democratic Convention keynote speech.
His campaign focused on themes of national unity, hope, and the audacity of hope. His unique background, born in Honolulu, raised by his mother and grandparents, a community organizer in Chicago, editor of the Harvard Law Review, it resonated deeply.
And his campaign leveraged social media extensively, leading to his victory over John McCain in 2008, making him the nation's first African-American president.
So if we connect this entire history to the bigger picture, what really stands out is this relentless pattern. It's a pattern of reform immediately followed by intense reaction.
Exactly. From the failures of the 15th Amendment that required the nonviolent movement of MLK to the explosive market power of the Gilded Age, which demanded the trust-busting of Roosevelt and the regulation of the New Deal.
American history is this long, ongoing experiment. It's defined by radical expansion, technological acceleration, and this continual political and social turmoil.
The ideals of 1776 are constantly being contested and redefined.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? Given the sheer speed of global change, from the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union to the rise of new terrorist threats and deep economic interdependencies, and knowing this persistent pattern of reform and reaction, how must the U.S. definition of freedom's asylum, as Thomas Paine called it, adapt its internal structure and external policy for the next age? That is a question worth mulling over. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up in next video.